What did I did for Shadowbringers?
ミニシナリオを全編を通して担当しておりました。
Oh, the main scenario pack for 5.0. She's overwhelmed. Overwhelmed.
止められなくなっちゃうから。
Oh my gosh. She's so overwhelmed that I don't know if we can continue doing the
You don't get this kind of reaction unless you've absolutely earned it. Final Fantasy has been an inseparable part of my life for as long as I can remember, but it's no secret I haven't always agreed with its storytelling decisions made in its modern games. At one point, I even thought perhaps maybe me and Final Fantasy had just grown separate ways. After playing Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, I can say with the greatest conviction, I am not only in love with Final Fantasy again, but I can also say with confidence that, in my opinion, Shadowbringers isn't just the best narrative experience I've had in FF, but it honestly ranks among the strongest I've had in any video game. All inside of an MMO RPG, which is probably going to greatly upset the single-player purist, but just hear me out. Wait till you get to Shadowbringers. That's all you will hear from every Final Fantasy XIV fan the second you touch this game. And for a good reason. Shadowbringers isn't just a huge climax to the mounting tension in Final Fantasy XIV. It also manages to be its own really incredible tale on its own right. In part, how it manages to accomplish both is through the use of the isekai, or otherworld genre. Now, normally, this is the official genre of that feel when no GF, but here, it's actually kind of based. The Scions of the Seventh Dawn find themselves far from home, in a new world known as the First, and in order to tell the story of this other world in Final Fantasy XIV, Creative Business Unit 3 delivers some of the strongest, most detailed world building I've seen from this franchise. This world has been drenched in corrupted light ether, giving dominion to unholy and unsettling beasts known as Sin Eaters. These designs range in appearance from menacing angels to the appearance of, fellas, be honest. These nightmarish fiends feed on living ether in order to survive, and consume mankind for their dining. If you're lucky, you might have the honor of being turned into one of these abominations, due to the flow of ether being so far biased toward the light. Whether it's being eaten alive or turning into a man-eating sin eater, or the blinding light destroying the world's ecosystem, the people of the First have come to accept that their world is a dying one, and they alongside it. A theme which manifests in a variety of ways, but none more compelling to me than that of the city of Yulmore. Yulmore is an isolationist city-state led by the rather voluptuous Lord Vothry. In this dying world, Vothry shepherds his people into a world of wine and sin. Lots and lots of sin. This hedonistic society seeks nothing other than the finest mortal pleasures to escape the reality of their mortal demise. The allure of Yulmore is then only enhanced by its exclusivity, only permitting entry to the most elite. All the meanwhile, the slums suffer and rot in the barren outskirts, creating a chilling societal divide. You have the village of Raktika, which has a religion built around the worship of darkness, and where they perceive light as the corrupting force. This framing of shadows under the lens of divinity affects everything in their culture and customs, even oddly specific details down to the fact that they use nicknames to avoid having their real names tainted by the light. And it's here that I want to note I'm making such a tremendous point about the world building in this game because it actually feels like they thought, if this concept were real, how would people actually react to it? Something I don't think the rest of the Final Fantasy franchise has managed to deliver in quite some time. Yet Shadowbringers does. And if you need a very specific example, look no further than Final Fantasy XV, where over the course of 10 years, the planet slowly begins to lose all sunlight. Something that would kill the majority of vegetation on the planet, disrupting ecosystems, and eventually killing off off all livestock, the planet's temperature and climate would drastically change, and while a fantasy game does not have to handle all these things in ultra-realistic details, it certainly does make your world much more believable when you consider some obvious consequences. Shadowbringers goes as far as giving all the vegetation that you see here a sort of violet hue because, and I kid you not, it helps the plants better perform photosynthesis in areas with harsh light. They actually thought how the plants would evolve. That is the kind of world building and storytelling that we're dealing with here. And again, while you don't have to do that, when the player does discover what you did, it brings them that much further into the world. And the authenticity and inspiration for the first goes even further than that. FF14 always shows love for the Final Fantasy series, and this time is no different in the form of the Crystal Tower. However, here there is also love for Final Fantasy XIV's own history. The citadel surrounding the Crystal Tower is actually the same city shown off in the 2005 Rapture tech demo that was used to demonstrate crystal tools rest in peace, before we even knew that this was actually going to be the 14th mainline Final Fantasy game. All of this comes together to make the first one of the most inspired locations I've seen in the series in a long time. Of course, it's not just the world building that sets the new gold standard for the series, it's also many of the characters, including yourself. Literally. The actualization of the player's Warrior of Light as a character unfolds in multiple ways. In one sense, the inclusion of Artbert, the ghost of the deceased Warrior of Light, who shares an appearance with you, at least in the FMVs, and whose actions thus far have mirrored yours, ultimately ending in his regret-filled demise. He is quite literally a plot ghost and a damn good one. Instead of what could have just been a flat exposition dump on you, this information is presented to you as part of Artbert's backstory, and it's heartbreaking. Imagine getting back from a long day of slaying Light Wardens, just so this handsome devil can be waiting in your hotel to tell you some depressing about his past, and it somehow be the best part of the game. Artbert not only gives you an attachment to the stakes, you want to see a resolution for him in doing what he could not. Our Warrior of Light tends to play more of a reactionary role, always in the center of the action, but never the driving force behind it, which for a silent protagonist really ain't all that unusual. However, in Shadowbringers, the game asks for your input far more than any of the game's previous expansions, even giving you a choice in which regions you want to tackle first after settling in the Crystarium. Dialogue choices are nothing new in Final Fantasy XIV, but it's the frequency and the polarization of the options in 5.0 that allows players to shape the personality of their Warrior of Light and create an actual voice for a protagonist who is now all but silent. And look, I know it may sound weird for me to gush over dialogue options in an RPG, but honestly, they haven't always been present in modern Final Fantasy, and the way they're done here is satisfying. While many of them are a mere illusion of choice, many more can lead to some incredible moments that can enhance the tone of a scene or give the player a good old LMAO. The other way in which you see your Warrior of Light given a front and center role comes at the cost of returning the night sky. In between slaying Light Wardens and simping over Emmett Selk, the Warrior of Light's body begins to break down. Aside from our first bout with Xenos clapping our cheeks like a standing ovation, the Warrior of Light is almost always shown as damn near indestructible. Even God King Thornton, powered by a millennia of prayers, trembled at your might. But taking on the eternal brilliance of the Wardens begins to wear at their body, which creates a personal conflict for your wall. And for the first time, not only in this game, but an extremely rare occurrence in any MMO, your character is depicted as the one who is vulnerable. You, the player, may very well die from something that is not an epic battle. It's some Goku dying from a heart virus and honestly, I love it. However, what choice do you have? Slaying Light Wardens is the only way to return balance to the first, and save all the shards, including your homeworld, but doing so destabilizes your ether, and may cause you to transform into the same foe that blights the land. It's a very complicated internal struggle, but you're not alone. You got the fellas. In previous expansions, you'd normally focus on a handful of scions at a time, but here, for the first time since means a realm reborn. The whole squad is together, and honestly, we them boys. Seriously, you just do not get a JRPG party with a better dynamic than this one. It's a cast of characters that make you feel like you're part of a tight-knit family, something that should be the aim of any respectable JRPG cast. All of the Scions receive brand new character arcs. Characters that I was only lukewarm on, such as Urianger and Thangrid, easily now are some of my favorite characters in the game. Characters that already had phenomenal development such as Alphino and Alize only get better here. The Scions being a JRPG party is now more than just a story thing, forcing you to crawl dungeons with real people. Disgusting, I know. However, new in Shadowbringers is the trust system, which allows you to take the Scions into dungeons, meaning they aren't just your story party members, but actual characters you can take into battle with you. The game also provides opportunities to play them as well. That's right, you can actually play as another character in an MMO RPG for story purposes. Bro, what? It just shows their level of dedication to deliver a quality narrative and not letting the confines of the MMO structure stop them, especially for the character-focused narrative that Shadowbringers provides. And boy, the characters are absolutely fire in this one. You got Giga Chad but low-key depressed. You got Giga Chad but high-key depressed. You got Lola Bunny. You got Dad. You got Dad but with more exposition. You got Jay-Z. I mean, they even got Naminé in this game. Of course, it's hard to talk about Shadowbringers without mentioning the man who makes it so entertaining. I'm not gonna beat around the bush here, so here's the hot take. Emmett Selk is the most well-written, well-delivered antagonist in the Final Fantasy series. But what makes Emmett so great is that ultimately his desires aren't that different from yours. To say Emmett is a villain isn't quite correct. He's the antagonist of your story, in the same way you are the antagonist of his. At the end of the day, everyone is fighting for the same thing in this conflict, for those they have lost and for those they can yet save. In much of the previous Final Fantasy XIV stories, the Ascians were almost cartoonish in their villainry, immortal mischief makers that had little to do with their time aside from putting shrimp in your cereal. Though learning more of their true plight recontextualizes so many moments that leave you with nothing but understanding. You are led so strongly to believe from preconceived notions, and being a warrior of light, that light is objectively good. Shadowbringers then shatters that concept by showing that light in excess can be the corrupting force, and the real enemy is unbalanced. Through all of this, Final Fantasy XIV is saying something much deeper to us, to consider that even though we are the heroes of our own story, we're the villain in someone else's, and that there are two sides to every story, and the answers aren't as clear as we want them to be. Shadowbringers and the greater narrative of Final Fantasy XIV is a story about people, just people that simply live in a different world than us. Going from the source to the first, we learn that man, cat, bunny, that those of us who walk on two legs suffer all the same afflictions. It's a story that remembers to use fantasy to reveal the truth of human nature through fiction, and it might just bring you to tears. One of the ways in which Shadowbringers brings you closer into these themes are its incredible music score. Normally, legendary FF composer Nobuo Uematsu composes the theme for each of the game's expansions, with composer Masayoshi Soken using a leitmotif and building off of the main theme. Here, Soken takes the reins as the main composer and created one of the strongest OSTs Final Fantasy has ever seen, and solidified him, in my eyes, as Uematsu's strongest successor. The absolute range and versatility of Soken is mind-blowing, and his ability to encode messages and themes into his music is simply unparalleled. Rather than only relying on the Latin language to encrypt a powerful statement, the majority of Soken's tracks are in English, and meant to hit you directly, and when he's speaking to you, it hits. Currently, it's rumored that Soken will be the main composer of Final Fantasy XVI, and if true, I could not be more satisfied. Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers is one of the most awe-inspiring stories, not just for the content of the story, but also how it's told. But most importantly, it remembers what the rest of Final Fantasy has seemingly forgotten at this point, that fantasy exists as a way to reveal the state of mankind, and it's not so into its own lore that it obscures or offers offers something contrary from its message, part of the critique I've had of so much of Square's recent writing. Shadowbringers offers what I believe to be one of the most mature stories from Final Fantasy we've seen yet. Not the superficial mature that is often reduced to meaning blood or fan service, but the story it tells is one for adults that grew up playing Final Fantasy games. Shadowbringers ask us what we do to process our grief, and that grief manifests in Thancred accepting the fate of Minfilia, in Emmett Selk having to accept the loss of his people and their homeworld, in Arbert losing his life, in the lives of his comrades, in dealing with his new state of existence. These are what makes Shadowbringers such a compelling story, and it's a story that will live with me for the rest of my days. But there's still one more major chapter left in this story. I'll meet you all at the end. Shout out to patron 1010 Thomas and the rest of the Ultima community.